Great, thanks, Beth. And I think, as we'll see, a lot of similar themes emerged in the session that I ran around centers of excellence. It really kind of focused on two issues in this particular session. One, really kind of thinking about or looking at, how or have companies and how have companies kind of adjusted their COE structures. We've seen a lot of discussion in recent years or questions at least being asked around, does a traditional COE structure and model, does it still make sense? Is it still relevant? Do we need to adjust it somehow? As well as kind of thinking about specific practices within each of these different COEs. I think in terms of the kind of structure, I didn't see any examples of companies kind of totally revamping their COE models. What we did see, similar to some of the trends that Beth talked about in other sessions, is really the pandemic served to accelerate as well as validate efforts to maybe modify, adjust, or add new centers of excellence. So participants were quite clear that it wasn't that the pandemic necessarily prompted these changes, but rather really moved them forward, or at least gave them greater confidence that these changes were needed. Some of the specific new centers of excellence that we heard companies adding were one around organizational development. I think this is largely being prompted by the increase in transformation happening across companies. So really kind of setting up a centralized function that is focused on things like organizational design, team effectiveness, as well as change leadership. Also saw a number of companies in different forms setting up COEs or not, sometimes not always COEs, but different structures or councils to really kind of manage programs, right? To really help to improve transparency, connection, and collaboration and communication across different COEs. So one participant, for example, noted that this was prompted by the fact that during the pandemic, 5 different versions of a mental health training program emerged within the organization. So these efforts are really designed to rationalize and consolidate these efforts to make sure that there's better collaboration across different parts of the organization. And lastly, a few organizations talked about launching an HR strategy COE, which is really, you can think of as more of an enhanced talent strategy COE, because it's in many cases largely focused on things like continuous recruitment, similar to the best point around talent acquisition, really coming to the forefront in many ways recently, workforce planning, as well as return to work efforts. So again, not necessarily due to the pandemic, but the pandemic helped to move some of these new COE efforts forward. At the same time, there's a lot of discussion in the working group about companies kind of really rethinking and retooling different functional practices as prompted by the pandemic. Probably the most obvious one is around learning delivery, given that we've seen virtually all learning kind of move online during the pandemic, which has prompted companies to really kind of focus on one, how can we effectively scale virtual learning across our workforce, but also has led to deeper analysis of really when virtual makes sense, as well as when it might make sense to go back to more of a in-person or higher touch type learning delivery. And that will really require an analysis of what we're trying to train or develop and considering what mode of delivery is best suited for that. Similarly, there was discussion around internal mobility. Excuse me. We've seen a lot of organizations increase internal mobility through the pandemic, in part because the impact of the pandemic has often been uneven across different business units. Some have fared extremely well. Some have been hit quite hard, which has required organizations to move talent and be much more mobile in moving and repositioning their talent. As a result of this, a number of participants noted that leaders have become more open and accepting of internal mobility. And to capitalize on this, companies are looking at building leadership training to further facilitate mobility post-pandemic, as well as to build supporting structures, things like career management frameworks, et cetera. Lastly, workforce planning. This is an area that has really become a challenge through the pandemic, given all the volatility and uncertainty that we've seen. But companies talked about a number of innovative approaches that they've adopted to deal with some of this. One being the idea of decoupling headcount forecasting from capability forecasting. Certainly, headcount forecasts have been largely thrown out the window in many cases during the pandemic, but capabilities don't change as quickly, and therefore are more enduring and can be used for more of these planning purposes. So kind of decoupling some of these different areas that may be more or less acceptable to some of the current situations or trends that companies are experiencing. So again, these were just a few of the key takeaways, but I think the general sentiment was that while the pandemic hasn't necessarily kind of blown up the COE model, it's provided an opportunity for companies to really rethink, number one, the centers of excellence that are needed, but also the specific practices and how to deliver those practices within the different various centers.